A telephone rang in a California aircraft factory, and the man on the other end didn't ask for an explanation. He just gave an order. I am canceling all your flying wing aircraft. No committee vote, no public hearing. Just a voice from Washington, and a program that had taken 15 years to build was over in one sentence. The man who answered that call had spent his entire career trying to remove things from airplanes. No tail, no fuselage, nothing but wing, because in his mind, everything else was just weight fighting gravity for no reason. He believed the perfect aircraft was the one with nothing left to take away. The United States Air Force believed something else. It believed there was one thing that could not be removed, and that was obedience to the men who controlled the contracts. His name was Jack Northrop. By the time that phone call ended, he had already built the airplane the Pentagon is still chasing today. What he hadn't survived was the man standing between him and the sky. Jack Northrop never sat in an engineering classroom. In 1916, at 20 years old, he walked into a garage workshop in Santa Barbara, California, and talked his way into a job as a draftsman for a small outfit called Lughead Aircraft Manufacturing Company. He had no degree, no formal training, nothing but a talent for drawing what other men could only describe. It was enough. Within months, he was working detailed drawings for a twin-engine flying boat, learning the discipline of aircraft structure from the inside out, one pencil line at a time. The First World War pulled him briefly into the Army Signal Corps, but the Lughead brothers wanted him back badly enough to petition for his release, and 6 months later, he was back at the drafting table. When Lughead folded in 1920, Northrop didn't stay idle for long. By 1923, he was at Douglas Aircraft in Santa Monica, working his way up from draftsman to project engineer, cutting his teeth on the design of the Douglas World Cruiser, the aircraft that would make the first flight around the globe. Then, in 1927, the Lughead brothers came calling again, this time under a new name, Lockheed. Northrop signed on as chief engineer, and what he built there would make him famous. The Lockheed Vega was a 6-passenger monoplane with a smooth cantilevered wing and no external bracing, a shape so clean for its era that record-setting pilots fought over who got to fly it. Amelia Earhart flew a Vega. Wiley Post flew a Vega around the world, twice. The company's own advertisements boasted that it took a Lockheed to beat a Lockheed. Northrop was 32 years old, and he had already designed one of the most successful aircraft in America. But something about the Vega bothered him. It was fast because its wing was clean. It would be faster still, he believed, if there were no fuselage hanging beneath that wing at all, no tail dragging behind it, nothing but the wing itself, shaped to carry crew, cargo, and fuel inside its own structure. He raised the idea inside Lockheed. Lockheed had no interest in gambling the company on it. In 1929, Northrop walked away from the aircraft that made him famous to chase an idea nobody else wanted to fund. He founded the Aviation Corporation with almost nothing, just a small team and a conviction that the industry had gotten the shape of the airplane wrong from the very beginning. Every rivet, every strut, every foot of fuselage skin that wasn't generating lift was, in his eyes, dead weight. The engines had to drag through the sky. It was a brutally simple standard, and he applied it without exception. If a part didn't produce lift, it had to justify its existence, or it had to go. By 1932, he had folded that conviction into a new company bearing his own name, Northrop Corporation, built around a single, uncompromising idea. Strip the airplane down to its purest form, a wing and nothing else, and the airplane would fly farther, faster, and cleaner than anything built the conventional way. It was a philosophy that would eventually produce one of the most advanced aircraft of its generation. It was also a philosophy that history would take nearly 40 years to forgive him for pursuing too early. By the end of the Second World War, the United States found itself facing a strategic problem it had never had to solve before. The next war, if it came, would not be fought across the English Channel. It would be fought across oceans against an enemy on the other side of the planet, and the Air Force needed a bomber that could reach that enemy without a forward base to refuel from. It needed range measured not in hundreds of miles, but in thousands, carrying a bomb load heavy enough to matter, and doing it in an era when nobody had ever built an aircraft that large or that far-reaching before. Northrop already had an answer in his desk drawer. He had been sketching flying wing bombers since the 1930s, and now, with the Army Air Forces desperate for intercontinental range, His obsession with eliminating drag suddenly looked less like an eccentric fixation and more like exactly what the moment demanded. A wing-only design meant less surface area exposed to the air, less structure to push through it, and in theory, more distance squeezed out of every gallon of fuel. The Army signed a contract. Northrop Aircraft would build it. But Northrop was not the only company chasing that contract, and he was not working in a vacuum. Down the California coast, and later out of Texas, a very different company was building a very different answer to the same problem. Convair, the result of a wartime merger between Consolidated Aircraft and Vultee, believed in bombers the way the Army Air Forces had always built them. Enormous, conventional, propeller-driven, brute-force machines that didn't need to reinvent the airplane to get the job done. Their answer was the B-36 Peacemaker, a six-engine giant so large that its wings alone stretched wider than a football field, designed to lumber across the globe on raw fuel capacity rather than aerodynamic elegance. Two philosophies, two companies, chasing the same government check. Northrop's flying wing promised to reach the target by weighing almost nothing extra. Convair's B-36 promised to reach the target by simply carrying enough fuel to outlast the distance, conventional shape and all. It was subtraction against addition, elegance against brute force, and only one of them was going to win the production order that would define American strategic bombing for the next decade. Northrop moved first. In the summer of 1946, his prototype, the XB-35, took to the air for the first time. Four massive contra-rotating propellers pulling a bomber shaped like nothing the Army had ever fielded. It flew. It actually flew. A pure flying wing hauling the weight of a strategic bomber at a scale nobody had attempted before. But propellers alone weren't going to be enough to keep pace with where aviation was heading. Jet propulsion was no longer a laboratory curiosity, it was becoming the future of military aircraft, and Northrop adapted his design to match, swapping the four propeller engines for 8 turbojets buried into the wing's trailing edge. The redesigned aircraft was renamed the YB-49, and on October 21, 1947, it lifted off from Muroc Dry Lake in California for its first flight. What happened next silenced a lot of skeptics. The YB-49 wasn't just a wing-shaped novelty that happened to stay airborne. It was fast. It was quiet compared to anything else that size. It climbed to altitudes conventional bombers struggled to reach. Test pilots and Air Force observers who watched it fly came away describing something that looked less like a bomber and more like the future of aviation arriving 10 years ahead of schedule. For a company that had spent 15 years building an aircraft nobody else believed in, it was validation. The Army Air Forces, soon to become an independent United States Air Force in its own right, had a genuine contender on its hands, an aircraft built entirely around the principle that less could outperform more. The flying wing had won its seat at the table. It had beaten skepticism, beaten the limits of 1940s aerodynamics, and proven that Jack Northrop's obsession with removing everything unnecessary from an airplane wasn't the fantasy his critics had assumed it was. What it hadn't beaten yet was Convair. And it hadn't beaten the men in Washington who would ultimately decide which company's philosophy got to define the next generation of American air power and which one got left on the runway. The numbers coming back from Muroc Dry Lake in early 1948 were the kind that made Air Force officials do a double take. On paper, the YB-49 wasn't just competitive with anything else in the American arsenal. It was, by several measures, in a class by itself. Flight testing clocked a top speed of 495 miles per hour, with the aircraft demonstrating bursts as high as 520 miles per hour in testing. Numbers that put a jet-powered flying wing bomber in the same speed bracket as fighter aircraft of the era, not lumbering strategic bombers. It could climb to a service ceiling of 45,700 feet, well above the altitude most contemporary anti-aircraft defenses were built to reach. Its designed range stretched out to a maximum of 8,668 nautical miles, and it could carry a bomb load of up to 32,000 pounds when configured for the mission. For an aircraft with no fuselage, no conventional tail, nothing but a wing shaped to do the work of an entire airplane, these were staggering figures. The shape itself was the reason why. Every surface on the YB-49 was there because it had to be, and nothing else. There was no fuselage tube dragging dead air behind it, no vertical stabilizer clawing at the wind for stability the way conventional bombers required. The airframe was, in the most literal engineering sense, almost pure wing, and pure wing meant a fraction of the drag that a B-36 or a B-29 had to fight through the atmosphere just to stay level. Northrop's obsession, the one Lockheed had refused to fund back in 1929, the one that had cost him his first company, was now producing a bomber that could outclimb, outrun, and outdistance almost anything else flying under an American flag. It didn't take long for the Air Force to notice. On June 26, 1948, the service ordered the design into a production track, contracting for the aircraft to be built as a reconnaissance variant, the RB-49A, with the expectation that more would follow. For Northrop Aircraft, a company that had spent nearly 2 decades building an idea nobody else wanted to underwrite, this was the moment that idea finally became policy. A wing with no fuselage was no longer an experiment tolerated at the edge of the Air Force's imagination. It was, on paper, about to become a program. None of this happened in front of an audience. There was no dogfight to win, no bombing run over enemy territory to prove the concept in combat, because the YB-49 never went to war. Its entire case had to be made in test flights, on instrument panels, and in the confidence of engineers and test pilots willing to put their names behind numbers that, a decade earlier, would have sounded like science fiction. That absence of a battlefield made the aircraft's rival different from anything Northrop's earlier designs had faced. There was no enemy squadron to outfly. The only opposition that mattered now sat behind desks in Washington and in a rival factory in Texas, and it was about to matter far more than anything the YB-49 could demonstrate in the air. Because for every test flight that came back with numbers that favored Northrop's philosophy, there was a quieter set of numbers accumulating on the other side of the ledger. Numbers about fuel burn and mission radius that told a very different story about what jet engines had actually done to the flying wing's greatest advantage. The aircraft that looked on the surface like it had already won the argument was about to discover that the same design choice responsible for its speed and its climb rate was quietly working against the one thing an intercontinental bomber needed more than anything else: the ability to get there and back. That discovery hadn't happened yet. In the summer of 1948, all anyone in the program could see was a strategic bomber shaped like nothing before it, flying faster and higher than the aircraft it had been built to replace, with an Air Force production order finally putting the government's money behind Jack Northrop's decades-old conviction. It felt for a brief and genuine moment like vindication. It would not last the year. The same jet engines that had made the YB-49 the fastest bomber-shaped aircraft in the American arsenal were, at the very same moment, quietly undoing the one advantage the entire flying wing concept had been built to deliver. When Northrop's team swapped out the XB-35's 4 propeller engines for 8 turbojets, they gained speed, they gained altitude, they gained a climb rate. No propeller bomber of that era could match. What they lost was fuel efficiency. Turbojets in 1948 were thirsty in a way propeller engines simply were not, burning through fuel at a rate that ate directly into the one number that mattered most for a bomber meant to cross an ocean without stopping. A design built from the ground up to squeeze every possible mile out of every gallon of fuel now had 8 jet engines drinking that fuel faster than the airframe's aerodynamic cleanliness could compensate for. The range that had once been the flying wing's entire reason for existing was shrinking, and it was shrinking below what Convair's much larger, much heavier, decidedly less elegant B-36 could deliver simply by burning propellers instead of jets. The philosophy that had won Northrop his contract, less weight, less drag, more efficiency, was being quietly outperformed by the brute force approach he had spent his whole career arguing against. It wasn't only fuel burn working against the design. A flying wing, by its very nature, gave up something every conventional aircraft took for granted: a tail. Northrop's engineers had spent years wrestling with the stability problems that came from removing the fuselage and the tail surfaces that normally kept a bomber predictable in a stall, in a turn, in the kind of abrupt maneuver a test pilot might be asked to perform at altitude. The YB-49 flew beautifully in level controlled flight. It was a different aircraft entirely when pushed toward the edges of its performance envelope, and everyone close to the program, from the engineers in Hawthorne to the test pilots strapping into the cockpit at Muroc, understood that the tailless shape that gave the aircraft its extraordinary efficiency also gave it a narrower, more unforgiving margin for error than anything the Air Force had flown before. None of that, on its own, should have killed the program. Every advanced aircraft of the era carried technical risk. That was the price of pushing the field forward, and the Air Force had absorbed worse trade-offs for less promising designs. But the YB-49 wasn't just fighting physics. It was fighting for a production contract in an industry that, in the years right after the Second World War, had far more aircraft manufacturers than the country's shrinking defense budget could realistically support. Wartime demand had built up a sprawling roster of companies capable of producing military aircraft. Peacetime demand could not keep all of them alive. Somebody in Washington was going to have to decide which companies survived the contraction and which ones didn't. And that decision was not going to be made purely on the basis of test flight data. Stuart Symington, the first Secretary of the Air Force in the newly independent service's short history, was the man positioned to make exactly that call. And Symington's instincts leaned, consistently and unmistakably, toward Convair. The B-36 program was already deep into production, already tied to a sprawling web of jobs, subcontracts, and political relationships that a conventional propeller-driven bomber built by an established company simply had more of than a radical flying wing built by a smaller outfit still proving itself. Whether that lean came from genuine strategic judgment about which bomber the country needed, or from something closer to favoritism toward the larger, more established firm, was a question that would follow Symington for the rest of his public life. But in the closing months of 1948 and into 1949, the pattern was becoming difficult to ignore inside Northrop's own offices. Every time the Flying Wing program needed a decision to go its way, it seemed to run into a Secretary of the Air Force whose sympathies sat with the airplane parked in a hangar in Texas. There were quiet conversations happening now that had nothing to do with drag coefficients or fuel burn. Word reached Northrop that Symington believed the post-war aircraft industry was carrying more manufacturers than the country could afford to keep funding, and that the smaller companies, Northrop's among them, were the ones that would eventually have to give way. The suggestion being floated, gently at first, was that Northrop Aircraft might not survive as an independent company at all, that its future, if it had one, might depend on merging into a larger organization built around the very bomber the Flying Wing had been designed to beat. Jack Northrop had spent nearly 20 years building a company around a single, uncompromising idea, that an airplane should be nothing more than what it needed to be to fly, and that everything unnecessary should be cut away without sentiment. He had applied that standard to airframes his entire career. He had never imagined he might one day be asked to apply it to his own company. The technical flaw in the YB-49 was real, and it was measurable. Sitting in the fuel logs and the range calculations, his own engineers couldn't argue their way around. But by the winter of 1948 into 1949, the airplane's future no longer rested only in the hands of the men who understood what those numbers meant. It rested increasingly in the hands of a Secretary of the Air Force who had already decided, in ways Northrop was only beginning to grasp, which bomber America was going to fly into the next decade, and which company was going to be left behind to explain why its own philosophy hadn't been enough to save it. Saturday, June 5, 1948, began as a routine test flight. The second YB-49 ever built, tail number 42, 102-368, rolled out of Muroc Air Force Base in the pale early light of the Mojave Desert with 5 men aboard. In the cockpit sat Major Daniel Forbes, an experienced Air Force pilot with the calm, methodical reputation test programs depended on. Beside him, in the co-pilot seat, was Captain Glenn Edwards, a decorated combat veteran of the war who had earned a master's degree in aeronautical engineering at Princeton and had been considered at one point for the Bell X-1 program before that assignment went to Chuck Yeager instead. Behind them were Flight Engineer Lieutenant Edward Swindell, a man who had already lived through history once, having served as a crew member on the B-29 that supported Yeager's supersonic flight the previous year, and 2 civilian engineers along for the ride as observers, Claire Lesser and Charles LaFountain. Their mission that morning was stall recovery testing, a standard but demanding part of any experimental aircraft's flight envelope evaluation. The crew needed to deliberately push the YB-49 toward a stall at high altitude and then recover control, gathering the kind of data that told engineers exactly how the tailless bomber behaved at the ragged edge of its performance, the edge Northrop's team had spent 2 years quietly worrying about. The flying wing climbed out over the Antelope Valley test range and leveled off between 20 and 25,000 feet. For nearly an hour, routine position reports came back over the radio. Nothing unusual, nothing to suggest the flight was anything other than another data-gathering run in a long test program. Then, as the aircraft began a run to measure longitudinal control forces at increasing angles of attack, the radio went quiet. No distress call, no warning. Just silence where routine chatter had been a moment before. About 20 minutes later, witnesses on the ground north of the base looked up to see the YB-49 come apart in the sky. Both outer wing panels tore away from the center section of the aircraft, ripping free at a speed and an angle no one on the ground could fully explain in the moment. What had been, seconds earlier, one of the most advanced bombers in the world became instantly an uncontrollable mass of wreckage. The stripped center section tumbled out of the sky, struck the desert floor north of Muroc in a flat, inverted attitude, and erupted into flame. All 5 men aboard were killed instantly. The exact mechanical cause was never fully settled. The leading theory, pieced together in the aftermath, pointed to the aircraft's clean, low-drag shape working against it in the worst possible way. During the stall recovery test, a sudden dramatic nose-over into a high-speed dive appeared to have loaded the outer wing panels far beyond what the structure could withstand. The very quality that made the YB-49 exceptional, an airframe with almost nothing on it to create drag, meant that once it began to dive, it accelerated with a violence a conventional, draggier bomber simply would not have matched. Whether the root failure began with a stall, a spin, or some other control anomaly, at altitude was a question investigators could never answer with certainty. What was certain was the human cost sitting in the wreckage. The Air Force would go on to name 2 of its bases after men lost that day. Muroc Air Force Base, the desert test facility the YB-49 had flown from, was renamed Edwards Air Force Base in honor of Captain Glenn Edwards, and it remains, to this day, the most storied flight test center in American aviation, a name spoken by every test pilot and astronaut who has followed in his path. In Kansas, Topeka Air Force Base was renamed Forbes Air Force Base in honor of Major Daniel Forbes. Both men are remembered permanently in the geography of American air power. Neither man lived to see whether the aircraft they died testing would ever prove itself. For Northrop Aircraft, the loss was more than a program setback measured in engineering hours and delayed test schedules. It was 5 names the company would carry for the rest of its history, a reminder that every mile of range and every degree of climb rate squeezed out of that radical wing shape had been paid for, in the end, with real people strapped into the airframe when its limits were finally found. The YB-49 program did not stop after the crash. Flight testing continued with the surviving aircraft, and the Air Force's interest for the moment did not waver. But the accident had opened a question that no amount of impressive speed or altitude data could fully close again. How much of the flying wing's brilliance was inseparable from a fragility that conventional bombers, with their heavier, more conservative shapes, simply did not carry? That question would still be unresolved 18 months later when a very different kind of ending arrived for the program, one that had nothing to do with metal fatigue or stall margins, and everything to do with a phone call from Washington. According to the account, Jack Northrop finally gave in 1979. After 3 decades of silence, the pressure had started building well before the crash faded from memory. Stuart Symington, he said, had approached him with a proposition dressed up as friendly advice. Northrop Aircraft should merge with Convair. The post-war industry, Symington argued, simply could not support every manufacturer that had scaled up during the war, and a company the size of Northrop's would be safer, more secure, folded into the larger organization already building the B-36. Northrop did sit down for talks, meeting with Floyd Odlum, head of the Wall Street holding company that controlled Convair, to hear out what a merger might actually look like. What he heard, in his own words, were terms he considered grossly unfair to the company he had spent nearly 20 years building. He had a workforce in Hawthorne that had stood behind him through every skeptical year of the Flying Wing's development, and he was not willing to hand their futures over to a rival on terms that favored the rival. He turned the merger down. Not long after that refusal, the order came. On March 15, 1950, with no public explanation offered, Symington's office canceled every remaining flying wing contract Northrop aircraft held. The reconnaissance variant, the bombers still in conversion, all of it, terminated in a single stroke. There had been no new crash, no fresh technical failure to point to. Flight testing on the last surviving YB-49 prototype had ended just one day earlier, on March 14th. And then, coincidentally or not, that same aircraft was destroyed in a high-speed taxiing accident and fire at the airfield, leaving almost nothing of the program's flight hardware still standing. What happened next was the detail that Northrop's own employees would carry with them for the rest of their careers. The Air Force did not simply mothball the remaining flying wing airframes in storage. The way canceled prototypes so often disappeared into a desert boneyard to wait, sometimes for decades, on the chance a program might be revived. Instead, the order came down to destroy them outright. Portable smelters were brought directly onto Northrop's own property in Hawthorne, California, and the remaining flying wing bombers, aircraft that had set altitude and speed records only months earlier, were cut apart and melted down into scrap, in plain view of the very engineers and machinists who had built them by hand. Only a single airframe, the lone YB-49A reconnaissance variant, was spared the smelters. Shortly afterward, when the Smithsonian requested that the Air Force donate one of the remaining flying wings to its collection as a piece of aviation history, Symington's office turned that request down as well, again without explanation. Jack Northrop watched his life's work reduced to raw metal on his own factory floor. Not long after, he stepped away from the company that bore his name, and he stepped away from aviation altogether, a 54-year-old engineer walking out of an industry he had helped invent, unwilling or unable to keep building inside a system that had just shown him exactly how little his designs mattered next to a phone call from Washington. There is an uncomfortable complication in this story that deserves to be stated plainly because the record itself is not simple. Everything about the merger pressure, the grudge, the deliberate cancellation comes from Jack Northrop's own account, delivered publicly for the first time in 1979, 3 decades after the events themselves. When the cancellation controversy first surfaced, back in 1949, a congressional investigation into the broader B-36 contract dispute gave Symington the chance to answer the allegations directly, and he denied, under oath, ever pressuring Northrop to merge. His version was different. The post-war aircraft industry genuinely could not sustain its wartime number of manufacturers. The YB-49 program was behind schedule and running over budget, and Northrop's own engineering staff, spread thin across multiple experimental projects at once, may have struggled to deliver the aircraft the Air Force actually needed on the timeline it needed it. Northrop, for his part, admitted in that same 1979 interview that he had gone along with clearing the Air Force of wrongdoing back in 1949, testimony he later called perjury, out of fear that speaking the truth would get his company blacklisted from every future defense contract. Shortly after leaving his post as Secretary of the Air Force, Stuart Symington became president of Convair, a detail Northrop and his defenders would point to for years as evidence of exactly where his loyalties had been all along. Whether that timing reflects a reward for services rendered, or simply an executive with deep industry knowledge moving into a natural next role, is a question the historical record has never definitively closed. What is not in dispute is the outcome. The engineer who had spent his career testifying that an airplane should keep nothing it didn't absolutely need had just watched an entire fleet of his most advanced aircraft reduced to nothing at all. The pilots who died proving the design were already gone. The workforce that had built those wings by hand was left standing in a factory yard, watching portable furnaces turn a decade of engineering into scrap. And the company built around Jack Northrop's single, uncompromising idea now had to find a way to survive without the man or the machine that idea had been built for in the first place. Jack Northrop did not disappear quietly after 1950. He drifted for a while into other pursuits, dabbling in real estate investments that cost him a significant part of his personal fortune. A far cry from the man who had once run one of the most innovative aircraft companies in America. But the flying wing never fully let go of him. In 1976, in Failing Health, he wrote to NASA, laying out his belief in the low-drag, high-lift principles behind the shape he had spent his career defending. NASA wrote back that the concept still had genuine technical merit, a small but real acknowledgement, decades late, that the idea itself had never been the problem. The company he founded did not disappear either, though it stopped building flying wings for a generation. Northrop Corporation carried on through the Cold War building conventional aircraft, from trainers to fighters sold around the world, quietly becoming one of the more durable names in American aerospace, even without the radical shape its founder had staked his reputation on. Decades later, in 1994, it merged with Grumman to form Northrop Grumman, the same company that would eventually be handed the contract for the aircraft that finally proved Jack Northrop right. That vindication arrived just months before he died, and it arrived in a way that reads, even now, like something out of fiction rather than an engineering trade press story. By the late 1970s, a series of illnesses had left Northrop unable to walk or speak. In April 1980, engineers from the company that still bore his name arranged the necessary security clearances and brought him, in a wheelchair, into a classified room to see something few people in the country were allowed to see. A scale model of the aircraft Northrop Corporation was building for the Air Force's Advanced Technology Bomber program, the black project that would eventually become the B-2 Spirit. The model in front of him was a flying wing. Its wingspan measured 172 feet, the exact same span as the YB-49 that had been melted down in front of his own employees 30 years earlier. According to B-2 project designer John Cashin, who was in the room, Northrop's eyes filled with tears as he held the model in his shaking hands, and it looked, Cashin said, as if his entire history with the flying wing was passing through his mind in that moment. Unable to speak, Northrop reached for a pad to paper and wrote a single sentence. "Now I know why God has kept me alive for the past 25 years. He died on February 18, 1981, roughly 10 months later, having never seen the B-2 fly, but having held in his own two hands proof that the shape he'd given his career to was not a mistake. The engineering justification for that proof had a name, and it was not something Northrop's generation ever had access to. The instability that had plagued the YB-49, the same tailless unpredictability that investigators suspected contributed to the fatal 1948 crash, came from a basic physical reality of the flying wing shape. With no tail to provide passive aerodynamic stability, the aircraft required constant, precise correction to fly straight and level. In 1948, that correction had to come from a human pilot's hands and a set of purely mechanical controls, reacting in real time to a shape that never stopped trying to wander. By the 1980s, digital fly-by-wire systems could make thousands of those corrections every second, faster and more precisely than any pilot ever could, holding an inherently unstable airframe rock, steady without the crew even feeling the adjustments happening. The B-2 succeeded not because Northrop's aerodynamic instincts had been wrong in 1947, but because the computing technology needed to tame that shape simply hadn't existed yet. He had been building the right answer to the right question 30 years before the tools existed to make it survivable. Nothing physical remains of the YB-49 itself. Every flying bomber from that program was either destroyed in the 1948 crash, lost in the 1950 taxiing accident and fire, or deliberately cut apart and melted down on Symington's order. There is no YB-49 sitting in a museum hangar today, no static display where a visitor can walk beneath that 172-foot wing and see in person what the fuss was about. The only surviving piece of the original flying wing lineage is the earlier N-9M testbed, a smaller experimental aircraft preserved and, remarkably, still flown on occasion at air shows, a faint echo of the much larger bombers that came after it and vanished completely. The historical verdict on the man himself has grown steadily kinder with distance. For decades after the cancellation, the YB-49 was remembered largely as a footnote, an interesting failure, a program the Air Force had been right to kill on purely technical grounds. That verdict has shifted. Today, engineers and historians point to the B-2 and to the stealth drones and unmanned combat aircraft that followed it, and describe Northrop not as a man whose designs failed, but as a man who was decades ahead of the electronics his airframes needed to survive their own instability. The airplane wasn't wrong. The century was. The story of the YB-49 has always really been the story of two competing definitions of what an airplane should be. Jack Northrop believed an aircraft should be nothing more than what it needed to be to fly. Every unnecessary ounce stripped away until only lift remained. Conveyor, and the Air Force that ultimately backed it, believed an aircraft should be whatever it needed to be to survive the realities of politics, budgets, and an industry too large to let every good idea win on its own merits. Northrop built a bomber that could outclimb, outrun, and outperform almost anything else in the sky, using nothing but the discipline of subtraction. The Air Force built a decision-making process that had very little to do with subtraction at all, one where the better airplane did not automatically win, where a phone call from Washington could erase 15 years of engineering in a single afternoon, no test data required. The phone call that opened this story ended a program. It did not end an idea. That idea sat quietly for 30 years, waiting for computers fast enough to hold an unstable wing steady in the air until it came back wearing a different name. Flying missions Jack Northrop never lived to see, carrying the same wingspan as the bomber that had been melted down in his own factory yard. He never got to watch it fly. He only got to hold it in his hands one time for a few minutes in a room he wasn't supposed to be allowed into. Somewhere over the Pacific tonight, a bomber shaped like nothing else in the sky is flying home. Almost no one watching it pass overhead will ever know the name of the man who drew that shape first and paid for it with everything he had.